This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Back in the saddle in Southeast Asia, back in the saddle to a place where I enjoy being. After 1 month in America, is that a prison sentence or is that a joy? It's probably a combination of both. Before I jump into sharing where I want to go today, I will offer a big picture thought about the current Middle East environment. When I was a teenager, I was asked to join the selective service in America shortly after the Marine Corps barracks were bombed in Lebanon. That was in Beirut, I believe. And at that point in time, as a young teenager, I expected I would be fighting in the Middle East somewhere. Now, that did not happen, but the conflicts in the Middle East kept happening. Conflicts that my country kept being involved in. And of course, as an American, we are told every story under the sun about why we must be involved in some particular conflict, whether that's Vietnam, whether that's Iraq, whether that's Syria, whether that's Ukraine, and probably what's going on right now, America will be involved in. And of course, most people will have their piss and vinegar worked up about the current conflict right now. So if you don't jump into their perspective about the right now, you are evil incarnate. However, I just rattled off conflicts that America has been involved in over the years that killed millions of people that had no strategic American purpose at all. I ask that all of you that might have a perspective to let that perspective lengthen, to look at history, to look at nation states, to look at conflicts over a continuum, over the millennia. Don't allow yourself to be worked up into a lather by the social media gurus about whatever is happening right now, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Israel. Everything will pass, but not everything will get better. And some things, as we all seem to be watching over the years, stay in conflict, continuous conflict. Now, you will note, I am not attempting to justify, pick a side, or anything. Of course, some of the images that I've seen most recently, the start of the most current conflict, terrible images. Again, I would implore anyone trying to discern modern conflict in modern times right now in 2023 to take a step back and look for the motivations. Look for the people behind the scenes. Look for the people that are pulling the strings. Look for the money. You might start to understand more of the conflict, more of the story. I guess one could take that perspective as a little bit of a reset, and maybe that describes the word reset, that describes my experience in America most recently. A friend and myself had a chance to go to several of America's key tourist areas. Now, this is after Labor Day, after early September, so not a lot of people around. And I must say, it was quite enjoyable. Some of the things that we went to, of course, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, standing outside the White House. We also did an extensive tour of Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, the first president of America. We did a tour and an extensive walkthrough of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Central Virginia, in Charlottesville. I must say, both of those places absolutely beautiful to go to early September with the sun out, not so hot, not so many people, to go back in time to try to feel the decision-making, the leadership of those men in that time. Now, of course, today, many people love to pick apart past American presidents. They like to find all of the negatives. But when you go to their homes and you put yourself, like I said, back in that time warp, it's an amazing feeling. They were brilliant men. They were accomplished men. They were leaders. In a way, to think about the power and the status and the wealth and the creativity and the leadership they had at that moment in time, they must have been like gods. Maybe I'm overstating that, but it's just terribly amazing, especially like in Jefferson's home, Monticello, to see the detail, to see the inventions, to see his perspective to build that home up on a mountain in central Virginia hundreds of years ago. Wow. It also makes some of our technology today not look so important because those guys had figured out a lot without having the smartphone back in the day. Now, of course, like I said, there will be some people out there that just don't care anymore. They're convinced because both of these men had slaves that they were evil incarnate. There could be nothing useful to be learned from them. Nothing beneficial happened because of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. That is a moronic perspective. You are a moron if you have that perspective. Sadly and unfortunately, if you do any homework, and it only takes a few clicks to find yourself into Wikipedia, but slavery has been a scourge across the world going back to the inception of humanity. I don't care the country. I don't care the race. It doesn't matter. Slavery is not new. Now, of course, if you're American, you like to think everything is number one about America, and it only happened in America, etc., etc. Clearly, that is a short-sighted and, again, moronic point of view. And also, if I say something like that today, typically you have to give all kinds of disclaimers because you don't want to be positioned as somebody who was supposedly supporting this convention back in the day. That's not my point. My point is, at that moment in time, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, amazing leaders, amazing entrepreneurs, amazing people that helped push history forward. A history at that moment in time quite different than where we have ended up today. And I could see this in contrast on my trip to America. For example, we went to the DC Zoo to see the pandas that will soon be leaving America because America and China are having a conflict. So far, only a verbal conflict. But how sad is that? For you history nuts out there, you know that the pandas have been in America since the early 70s. Nixon brought them over. Panda diplomacy. Nixon opening up a relationship with China, and the pandas were a gift from China. And I got to say, it was quite fun to go down to the DC Zoo to see the pandas. Yeah, a typical tourist thing, but it was very cool. But as I bring up George Washington, I bring up Thomas Jefferson, I bring up the pandas at the DC Zoo. Unfortunately, to go to the DC Zoo today, to just stroll around and see the pandas, is an experience in seeing all of the bad sides of America. You see on display the bad behavior. You see the lack of morality, the lack of civility. Now, some people might say, well, there was no morality and no civility back in the Jefferson-Washington times, but that doesn't feel like to be the case to me. It feels like back in the day, those men faced a different type of history, a different point in history, and they dealt with what they dealt with. But we have not progressed since those moments. We've devolved. We've devolved in a way where I go to America and I think to myself, what can improve this? Now, most Americans don't see any of this. Most Americans just go to the mall, they get in their car, they drive to the strip mall store, they drive to the big mall store. This is typical life. So how does one know that it's not good, or how does one know that it's bad? Well, for me, when you go to places like Monticello, when you go to places like Mount Vernon, Jefferson and Washington's home, it felt like a reset. It felt like I was resetting myself in a way, forcing myself to go back in time to realize that our current time right now is not so important, or it's definitely not what we think it is. Again, as I push you to think about in the beginning of this podcast, what is the source of these conflicts? What is behind these conflicts? Who is behind the curtain? Who is pulling the strings? I mean, are you just sitting there with your only information flow is social media, Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC? And via those networks, those channels, you will now put on your social media page some I support or I hate perspective up? Is this it? Again, this is why, for me, I lucked into this, going to these historical locations in America for the first time in decades, frankly. But I lucked into it because it reset me. It gave me a longer time perspective, a longer time horizon than just staring at whatever bullshit we're being fed on a daily basis. I also did one other really cool thing while I was in America. I went to the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And we ended up, I was with a friend from Vietnam. She had never been there, a big fan of flying. But we went to the Wright Brothers Memorial. And we climbed up and we looked at where and how they did their first flights. We looked at the ingenuity, the little museum they have there. Now, look, it's very impressive about George Washington. It's very impressive about Thomas Jefferson. But it's probably equally impressive or more impressive to dig into the details of the Wright brothers and them putting that first plane up and going to where they did it. That was a major reset. And at all of these locations, it was interesting to observe who was there. Much older folks, typically, at Mount Vernon, at Monticello, at the Wright Brothers Memorial. People that were respectful of history, respectful to perhaps relearn what they had forgotten from their childhood. When you go to a place like where the Wright brothers did their first flight and you stand there and you look at the vantage they looked at and you think about what they did, how they did it, the brilliance these two men had, you're in awe. You're in absolute awe. And then what is the contrast to that? The contrast to that are all of the people that I just mentioned on social media or Fox News or CNN screaming that you must do something. You must believe something. You can't discover it yourself. You can't observe how the airplane was made. You can't observe where the first flight was flown. No, you must just listen to some propaganda from some bullshit corporate types being read off a teleprompter. You see the disconnect here? You have the reality over here. Here's where George Washington lived. Here's where Thomas Jefferson lived. Here's where the first flight was. And then over here, it's just a bunch of shit being read to you off a teleprompter. Yes, it's about the reset. Yes, it's about stepping back, stepping away to get perspective. And I would be amiss if I didn't add a little trend following nugget in here in the middle of this presentation. But if you have this perspective that you can step back, it's much easier to be a trend following trader because you're not glued to the bullshit. You're not glued to the daily messaging. You step back and you realize, oh, okay. Now I see why something like trend following can work, because humans don't change. Humans, they're born, they die, and a new crop is always coming. So all that irrationality, all of that insanity will be there for every new crop of humans. But when you take a step back and you reset, you see, hey, we're nothing special. Our generation is nothing special. So what can we do to navigate our limited time on this planet in a healthy and happy way? And maybe my little message today will implore some people, especially that perhaps live close to the places that I've mentioned today, to go see them again, to reset. But I got to tell you, I'm up against a vicious system that doesn't want people to think how I'm talking about today. This vicious system is run by maniacal sociopaths, and they do not care about right or wrong. They care about getting what they want at any cost. I recently completed a new interview on my podcast. You can check that out. And I received some feedback about that interview. Let me read that feedback. Sir, I would like to be frank. I give you a lot of credit for not ripping Professor Ass Clown a new one. I've seen this firsthand when I was in grad school 10 years ago. The postmodernist form of Marxism is completely cult-like. These people just flip figures completely void of reality to support their story. It's horrifying religion that has captured academia and holds no truth. Our welfare system, combined with our education system, is going to send us in the direction of Argentina. Looking at this as a religion and thinking back, I can only see why Martin Luther said, "Fuck it," and translated the Bible. The only thing that makes these cultists buckle is truth to fact. This is the number one reason why they are against free speech. In reality, it undermines their religion. The only way you could have brought out the light is probably with a 4-hour interview going over all the figures in their entirety, with help from a polygrapher and a non-captured statistician. These people are professional liars. If I told you all the bullshit they're pushing in grad school, it would blow your mind. I could go on, but I don't want to bore you. I hope to do the expat thing myself in the near future. I'm ex-military and well-traveled, having visited 29 countries and counting. Anyway, please keep up the good work. I really enjoy your podcast. And I really appreciate that feedback, because this interview with this professor was amazing. It's the type of conversation that you don't expect. So when you listen to it, you might be saying, gosh, I wish Mike would come back harder. I wish Mike would hit back harder. Or I wish Mike would say this. But when you're talking to somebody and you put numbers on the table and they either do a 100% misdirection, they lie, or they just make something up, and they're a prominent professor, you don't expect that. You don't expect that. You don't expect to be facing that type of bullshit, that type of propaganda. We all love to quote George Orwell's 1984, but when you live it and when you see people in prominent positions as mouthpieces for the state, unable to face reality, unable to face truth, and immediately, and this is how they do it, if I bring up the facts and figures they don't like, immediately, what am I? I'm the devil. I'm the bad guy. I'm whatever name they're going to call me next. This is how the system rolls today. I bring up all of these experiences as a contrast to go back in time, to think about Washington, to think about Jefferson, to think about the Wright brothers, to think about panda diplomacy. Then to have this professor on my podcast who clearly doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't care about that. He's got his mission. He's being paid for something. And he's going to sell that mission. And anyone who's standing in front of him, it doesn't matter. He's going through them like a hot knife through butter. I think ultimately this is the perspective that I gained by spending a lot of time outside of America to see inside the bubble that perhaps if you're in that bubble, you don't see. I've said it many times in this podcast, get on a plane, go somewhere. And I'm not talking about the Greek vacation or the UK vacation. I'm talking about putting yourself outside of the Western, European, American democracy stuff. Go do something radically different. Find people that are in a radically different environment. And you know what you might find? You might find that radically different environment that you've never experienced, you might find that when you get there, they're actually living in the environment that you used to live in. Meaning your country used to be a certain type of place, and that place is gone. But the place that you're afraid to go to, the place that you're afraid to visit, maybe they've got figured out what your country once had figured out. Now, you're never going to understand what I'm saying unless you get on the flight and go experience. And we get enough people thinking like I'm talking about today, being curious, being willing to be the explorer, the adventurer, like that Disney movie Up, the old man that put the balloons on his house. Don't you want to be the old man who puts the balloons on his house and just flies away to somewhere? Or do you just want to sit there eating fucking McDonald's every day, going to the fucking mall every day? Challenge yourself. Go find some history in your area. Reset yourself. Turn off the propaganda. It's never going to end. It's going to be there 5 years from now. It's going to be there 10 years from now. It's going to be there 20 years from now. The only way you can reset is by you. You have to pull the ripcord. You have to say enough. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.